Welcome back to the CAST series of concrete construction and material. In this video we're going to cover concrete finishes with a bit of attention to the relevant Australian standards. Now, generally speaking, concrete construction is governed by quite a large standard, AS 3600. This covers a broad range of the technical aspects of placing concrete, which is very important to get an appreciation of. I guess to an architect and to a designer, the smaller off-form concrete standard AS 3610 is perhaps one to pay not more attention but to be aware of, because in that standard it does set, I guess, the quality control of how to specify different off-form concrete finishes. Now, it's important because to simply specify the highest quality concrete finish all the time will make our construction very expensive. The standard AS 3610 will define the surface types in different situations, so concrete that is not meant to be seen as a decorative finish right up to the highest quality exposed decorative concrete. Now, if we look at this example, which is the Sir Lew Edwards building at the University of Queensland campus, we can see a very high quality finish of concrete specified. However, it doesn't matter how high a quality you specify, there are still limitations in the material, and in particular the limitations in I guess what's buildability in general. Now, we can see there's been in this instance a very close attention to detail that hasn't quite come off in some instances. In the bottom you can see a very lovely set of details where we've got a coloured concrete in situ on top of a grey coloured concrete with a stone cladding insert, and all three of these elements are coming together rather nicely. You can see that there's been a construction joint built into the formwork to transition between one type of concrete to the next. Now, if we look to the corresponding image above, we can start to see some issues with the way that the concrete material behaves, and in particular uncontrolled cracking, and how certain weathering starts to degrade the way that the concrete looks. So in this instance, in the top left hand corner, you can see from that small rebate there's an uncontrolled crack coming up from there through the wall, and that's attributed to the differential sort of movements between that rebate and the large concrete in between, and the geometry of the concrete coming into that. It's a very easy thing, I guess, mistake to make. It's not really a mistake, but more a bit of an oversight. The other thing as well, we can see when we don't put drains, or I guess a weathering slope onto the concrete, we start to get a lot of build-up of dirt and grime and so on. And again, over time, this can make the concrete look just a little bit, just a little bit daggy, I guess. But this is counterposed in this instance with the precast concrete fin that has a very high level of finish and a nice polished edge. So whilst everything comes together in a almost as a sort of specifying to the highest quality possible, the way that all of these things are coming together hasn't quite hit the mark. Now, we can also see some of the difficulties of like a very high specification and looking at, planes of concrete coming into one another in a very uncompromising way. So looking at the top left hand corner, we can see a canopy that's cast in the grey concrete coming against a wall that's cast in a coloured concrete. Now, because the two had to be cast separately, the formwork joined between them, and because there's no rebate or anything around there, has meant a very the necessity for an extremely tight join there, which is almost impossible for such a sharp angle. And as a result, when the second pour of the roof came on top of it, we're getting a lot of leakage and spoil coming from, I guess, the bleed water from the concrete pour above it, which has then stained the coloured concrete below in an uncontrolled and unsightly way, which is virtually impossible to get rid of. So I guess the take-home story with that is you always need to be conscious of the sequence of how the concrete is going to be put together, and the difficulties that you're setting up to the builder in order to execute this. So perhaps a little bit of consultation with the builder would help to avoid some of these things in a slight redesign to make it easier and to give a better finish. You can also see in the bottom right hand corner, again, although a very high quality finish specified, there's a lot of imperfection in that, a lot of blowholes on the outside, and the colour consistency of that wall is not brilliant. So although you can specify the highest, concrete as a material is reasonably unforgiving and hard to work with to get absolute perfection. And perhaps the thing is just to simply accept that and to design with it. Here's another project, again at the University of Queensland on the back of the old Biological Sciences Library, an extension done by Wilson Architects. Here you can see quite a nice outdoor room with quite a large and heroic in situ concrete structure with some fairly impressive cantilevers and different ins and outs. Now, if we just pay attention, I guess, to some of the surface finishes, from a distance it actually looks quite okay. It's just a very simple grey off-form concrete. But when you sort of get a closer look, you can start to see where the joins between the two I guess panels of the formwork have come together and result in a slight sort of overlap and a lip where they haven't quite aligned properly. Now again, this is always very difficult to control with in situ concrete, and often you just have to accept it and perhaps incorporate that into the detail. Now we can see on the top right hand slide, sorry, the pattern of circles that's going up the wall. Now these circles are, I guess, cross ties in the formwork. Now when you are setting out formwork for an in situ concrete wall, it's important to have a series of bolts holding the two sides of the wall together. Now these bolts are removed when the formwork is removed, and then the builder goes along and fills them in with grout. So an off-form concrete wall will always have a series of these holes which are evenly spaced to bind the two sides of the formwork together during construction. And it's up to the architect to specify, I guess, the pattern of these, so that when working with the builder, that they're careful to ensure that these holes are placed in a sort of a rhythmical pattern so that it actually looks rather nice. Now you can see other imperfections when you look close, in particular the bottom left hand corner where you can see a little plastic star. Now that is in fact when we're seeing in a previous video with a slab on ground a little plastic chair to hold the reinforcing mesh above the ground. Well, this is the same sort of thing but for a wall, and the plastic little chair makes sure that the mesh is held off the wall at a certain distance. And in this instance, the formwork, or maybe it was hit by the vibrator as it was being placed, and it's offset that plastic chair, and as a result it's actually blown through and is now visible on the outside of that surface. Again, not a lot you can do about that. Now there's the other approach, in which case you take on board the fact that the concrete's going to stain, that the formwork is going to be a little bit rough, and celebrate that in a way. Okay, this is a rather idiosyncratic project. It's the Highgate Hill house from Donovan Hill, quite an old project, and this massive concrete stair was made, in fact, the shuttering or the formwork was made from waste material from the site. So any demolition materials were kept, and they were used then to form the concrete. And so there's this varying pattern of boards and horizontals that give the character to the concrete, and even the use of profiled metal sheets. You can see with the big lump there, that gives that sort of nice horizontal lines that almost looks a little bit like a ruin. So while one can strive for perfection for off-form concrete, one's not always able to achieve it. Now, the other way of disguising off-form concrete imperfections is to work it somehow with mechanical tools. Now, this is the older side, or the original part of the biological sciences library, which had, I guess, a distinct pattern in the formwork. So it would have had a series of vertical, probably timber elements, to give that series of vertical stripes into the concrete. But then it was over-finished, what's called, given a bush hammer type of effect. Now, there's bush hammering is quite common in stone masonry. You can see on the top left-hand corner is a hand bush hammer, and on the top right is a mechanical version that's used in concrete work. So basically, the bush hammer scabbles the surface and roughens it all up, and that tends to sort of, if you accept that rough surface, it blends out any of the imperfection in the surface of the concrete. Now, this bush hammering effect is not as common nowadays, simply because it's very labor intensive, which ends up actually costing a reasonable amount of money just in people hours alone, which is why there's probably a lot more emphasis nowadays on off-form finishes. Here's another mechanically finished surface. Again, this has just come straight off the mold, and then it was sandblasted with a sort of a high-powered grit that just takes, it roughens the surface a little bit, gives it a sort of almost a sandstone effect, and takes out the imperfection. And then there's the more contemporary effects where one can use stains and acids and so on to apply to the surface of the concrete to make a pattern that, I guess, works in harmony and in some senses disguises some of the imperfections of the concrete, and perhaps celebrates it as part of the pattern itself. And we can start to see a whole repertoire of potential concrete finishes in this art built-in project at the Ipswich Courthouse, where we can see patterns from what looks like tyre tracks, other embossed elements that have been put onto the formwork, through to parts of the design that have been hammered into place, or even using an acid to etch away part of the surface. So that ends the sort of brief introduction to surface finishes. What we've tried to show is that a lot of the surface finishes, particularly nowadays, are achieved through just simply off-form concrete, but one needs to be careful, and one also needs to reference the standard AS3610 to make sure that you convey your intention to the builder. There's other techniques then where you can apply either finishes to an off-form concrete, or use a mechanical process to sort of roughen up or scabble the surface to disguise the imperfections. There are many other techniques that you can discover by working through some of the resources that have been uploaded onto the Blackboard site as well. So thanks again for listening.